Greetings and welcome to this edition of Rock County Civics Academy. The Rock County Civics Academy is a production of Common Sense Reestablished LLC, a public affairs communications company dedicated to community service, focusing on gathering and disseminating information regarding matters of public interest and encouraging public debate and discussion of matters of importance. We are not affiliated with any organized or unorganized political organization and exist for the sole purpose of providing a source of unbiased fact without hyperbole or colored by bias. We believe that a healthy discussion and debate of the merits of matters of public interest should be encouraged and supported. Our ability to provide these Rock County Civics Academy presentations is solely dependent upon the financial and other support we receive from our growing family of benefactors and you, our faithful listeners. Our growing list of benefactors include Big Radio, WCLO, WJBL, Have Camera Wisconsin, Tom Edwards, Ragnar Ltd. And Ragnar Software, ragnarsoft.com, Havana Coffee on Milton Avenue, the John Westfall family, the Italian House, and JATV Channel 994, Local Access, and JATV Media Pro Forma, Brian Bridges, and Dan Plushik's Janesville News Report. If you believe in our mission, we will welcome your financial support. Materials explaining our mission and financial support opportunities are available at the registration desk or by visiting our website, commonsenserockcounty.org. Our programs are provided live on tape on JATV, Local Access, and YouTube. Out of the respect of our guests, we ask that you silence your cell phones, and remember, you are an important part, and it is an interactive telecast that many rely upon as their primary source of unbiased information about the critical issues that affect you every day here in the Rock County. And now, we turn things over to Rich Gruber, who will introduce this edition's program guest.
Thank you, Paul. And good evening, folks. Welcome to this edition of the Rock County Citizens Academy. I want to reach out and I guess extend a special thank you to the panel that we've assembled tonight, because when we started thinking about this topic, we said this has been a conversation piece in the city of Janesville for many years. And it got exacerbated, as it were, when Pick and Save closed about 5 years ago. And the situation is such that, well, people are saying we need to have ready access to food and a wide variety of foodstuffs at affordable prices, because it dramatically impacts our quality of life. It's for that reason that we, as we normally do as the Rock County Civics Academy, look outside the box a little bit. We're first to admit that not all the great ideas that are generated to solve problems come from here in the city of Janesville. And in fact, we have to look around to see what other folks do. And that's good for two reasons. One, it's an opportunity for us to avoid making the mistakes that others do. But two, and perhaps more importantly, it's an opportunity to see if we can't replicate the successes of other people and bring those solutions to our community in the hopes that we can make things happen. So our goal tonight is to have a conversation about what is, by all appearances, has all the makings of being a real success. In the city of Madison and the Southside, they literally are in the same predicament, as it were. They can be easily labeled as a food desert. And in a creative moment, the city of Madison and Mauer's Urban Markets got together with some other folks, and they decided to look outside the box and find a solution to a problem, and they're well on the way to doing just that, providing the services that the community has asked for a long time, and doing it in a fashion that is not only affordable and effective and efficient, but it's close to home. which makes so much of a difference. So what better way to get acquainted with how Madison has taken on the challenge than to bring the folks from Madison here to have a conversation with us. And it's my pleasure to welcome first to my immediate right, Christy Maurer, who is the president of Maurer's Urban Markets. Christy, welcome.
Thank you.
Glad to have you here. To her right is Dan Rolfs. Dan is the Economic Development Manager, project leader for this project. He's part of the real estate division of the City of Madison, and he's kind of been the guy that makes things happen between the Madison City Council and the business community, and he's the catalyst that makes the magic actually work. To his right, I've got Gail Price. Gail is a familiar name, I think, to many people. He's the former economic development manager for the city of Janesville. He's now in the private banking world, and he works in the area of business development, so this should be, his insight will be very helpful tonight. And finally, last but not least, is Heather Miller. Congratulations, Heather. You just came off a successful run for re-election for the city council, and by the way, I think if I look at the history books, you topped the record for accumulating votes of a single candidate in a single election for the city of Janesville in its 100 and a bunch years history. So congratulations, that's a pretty special thing.
Thank you.
So welcome to all of you. I'm going to pass the microphone over to you, Dan, as we begin, because I think I'd like for you to take a minute and lay out just how this project is formed. Give me the parameters of what we're dealing with.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and it's very nice to come down and chat about some of the work that we've done. Just a caveat before I start speaking, any of the opinions that come out of me are definitely my opinions and mine alone, and do not reflect the opinions of my esteemed employer. So that's the part that hopefully keeps me out of trouble. That said, so the city of Madison has a piece of ground on the south side of Madison. It was the former Truman Olson Army Reserve Center, and in around 2011 or so, the Department of Defense decided they no longer needed it. And there was a long process, as those things tend to be, to acquire the site. And we bought it for just over $1 million, and then we had it, and the original intention was to build affordable housing as required by that surplus process through the Department of Defense. Long story short, that didn't happen because somewhere along the way we got wind that the property right next door, which holds the Pick and Save, was going to close. And Pick and Save wanted to shut down that particular grocery store, which was really the only remaining full-service grocery store for South Madison. South Madison is historically the most diverse portion of our city. It's almost a majority-minority area of our community. And the other piece that impacts, particularly from a grocery perspective, is a good portion of the trade area. So places where folks would come from to shop at that grocery store is covered by two things that don't have houses. One of them is Lake Monona. The other one is the University of Wisconsin-Madison Arboretum. Those things don't have any homes. There are no people that live there. So the trade area that this grocery store serves is naturally constricted. So there's just not as many people that shop there. So we went through an original RFP process, a request for proposals, to ask for folks that would come and open a grocery store on this new site, and it didn't work. The proposals that we got were infeasible, and so we had to start over again. That was another 12 months later, and we issued another request for proposals and went beyond just just the adjacent property owners. And we got 4 respondents, one of which was a gentleman named Renewal from Milwaukee. He is essentially a new developer who works at developing tax credit funded affordable housing. He's had some successes in Milwaukee and is now branching out into Madison. The challenge that we face in this particular site, and this is something that the city requires, is the South Park Street corridor where this property sits is in what's called an urban design district. What that means is that, for all intents and purposes, anything that's developed there must be at least 2 stories. Now, there aren't a lot of 2-story grocery stores, And the places that they are usually very, very, very dense environments. Chicago, Milwaukee, very large cities. So to do anything over 2 stories or 1 story and over means you need to have some other use. So what we got was a lot of folks proposing housing over the grocery store. So we started working with Brandon and his team and the folks at Moving Out Incorporated, and they are a provider of affordable housing. And we worked with them to go through their land use approval process and the design of the project, and work with their grocer that they had with them at the time. Throughout this process, we came across multiple hiccups and hurdles. Probably the largest was when you do a tax credit project, you have to close on those tax credits to do the project early on in this process. And normally that's fine if you're just going to build housing, because you've got a developer that brings their own equity, the capital that they're putting in, and the tax credits come with the other piece of equity, and that's all there is, and that's fine. The challenge here is that you essentially have 2 separate condominiums in this project. The grocery store, this 24,000 square foot space, is one condominium. The apartments is a separate condominium. And the tax credit investors are very happy that you have the money to do the apartments, but they also need to know that the development team, this is Renewal and Moving Out, have all the money to complete this. So we had to step in and do a little bit there as well. So it's been a long process. We then had to work with Christy to come back, and there's a lot more to tell.
Oh, and that's really just the beginning of the story. And to me, I think the next part of that story, the next part of the narrative is, where did Christy Maurer and Mauer's Urban Markets get into the equation? And frankly, what were the challenges that you faced? Because you're in a situation where you have to develop a grocery store in a very non-traditional physical setting. It's a combination of single-story and multi-story. You had some challenges. How did Christy Maurer get involved, and why?
Well, I've been involved since the beginning, in terms of at least being interested and having my eyes on the project. And I live in Madison. I ran a store not far from there for a very long time. And so being part of this project was honestly a culmination of a lot of conversations and really paying attention to what's going on in the community and noticing, and the grocery community is noticeably very small. So we hear things and we know things. And so when I kind of got word that maybe there was some questions that needed to be answered in terms of this project, I called up Dan and said, I'm around, and if you have any questions or concerns, or if there's anything I can do as a patron of Madison, I'm happy to assist. And it developed from there.
And we're going to come back and talk a great deal about just how it developed and some of the intricacies of this entire project, because this is a unique project. It's a different approach to doing business than what we have seen in this community. And I think probably nobody better to talk about the contrasts of the Madison project versus the experience here in Janesville than you, Gail Price. In your years as the Economic Development Director, and prior to that, in your years in the planning department, building department, and now with the perspective of an investment banker, talk a little bit about how Madison approached this versus the traditional way Janesville does business. Yep.
So the way Madison takes the approach is, with a request for a proposal, they're controlling the land. They are basically encouraging the skilled developer to come forward and bring forward an idea or a package that makes financial sense, makes business sense, and then ultimately some political sense, because you've got to get the buy-in of the council to say you're going to do this. In Janesville, we've really kind of taken almost a laissez-faire approach, allowing the development community to drive things. One of the things that I always think about as a city planner, as a young city planner from Cincinnati, we were like, oh yeah, let's get urban development going, multi-stories, all this stuff, and look around Janesville. We don't have the need for the multi-story buildings. We don't have the real estate value that drives much of that vertical development. So everything's one story, right? So we've also historically taken the approach that we allow the development community to drive that. And the city has not been that holder of the real estate requesting proposals. You know, as you can imagine in City Hall, if we took this approach, there would be a lot of debate. Somebody has to drive that. How do you arrive at the prioritization and what that looks like? So it is very interesting. We're only 30 miles apart and we're doing business totally different. And sometimes there's merits in doing it one way versus the other. Certainly the Madison way has a lot more control and ensuring that you're ultimately getting to a series of goals. But who sets a series of goals? And that's one of the things that's my mother tongue, city planning. You know, we're all about collaboration, communication, and consensus. And that takes time. That takes time to have the discussion. And unfortunately, over the last 9-10 years, we, as a community, as City Hall, really hasn't done a lot of that. So if you don't have that best laid plan and then those steps for implementation, it's kind of hard to get there when the private sector may have kind of their own thoughts.
Pass that microphone on to Heather, because Heather is a member of the Janesville City Council. And the biggest challenge that the Janesville City Council has to deal with is the fact that there is a demand for services in the South Side that is not being met in the minds of a lot of people. But it takes the political will of those folks on the council to give the directive to staff to take on challenges. And it puts members of council such as Heather in an interesting position, because you have lived this situation, you're a Southsider. Share with us your perspective from where you sit on just what the problem is we're trying to address.
I understand the position because, again, I live there. I see where it's difficult to grocery shop like everybody else unless I make a 20-minute drive. And so that tends to be a little taxing after a while. It tends to be a little irritating when I can't just run down the street. Our options are very limited. And sometimes, and I've been told this on multiple occasions, you feel like your wishes are falling on deaf ears. And so, being the Southsider, I have heard this time and time, dozens of times over the last 2 years. And it's not stopping. You know, I bring this to city management. I've brought it to our former city manager on many occasions. I've had discussions with Gail Price years back. And at the end of the day, I'm still being told that we don't have a business that's willing to set up shop here. And like you said, we're driven by somebody who's willing to take that risk. We're not initiating that move.
Pass the microphone down to Dan. And Dan, I'm going to put you on the spot because you are sitting in kind of the catbird seat. You are the liaison in many respects between the directive of council to make something happen and the Christy Mowers and others in the community that want to make something happen. You're kind of the magic in the middle that pulls it all together. But Heather made a really interesting observation, and I think it's a critically important observation. The Madison City Council exercised their political will to address the issue. Speak to that if you could, Dan.
I think that hits the nail on the head, is political will. Because a lot of the work that I do requires, all of the work that I do requires buy-in and approval by policymakers. And I've said it sort of internally, but I'll do stuff until they tell me to stop. And if they've given me or anyone at the city the goal of go do, in this case, find a grocery store and make it happen, I have, it's not carte blanche, but I have a sense of, as a staff member, what will fly and what won't. And I can go to folks like the folks at Renewal Enterprises who we're working with and moving out, and the Christy Mowers of the world, and represent that if there's a shortfall or a problem or whatever it is, we'll figure out a way through it. And the solutions are always creative and interesting, but I know at least, or I have a sense of what they will support. And if they're backing me, I have a lot more ability to get things done. Without that, it's just a lot of hot air.
In our earlier conversation, Dan, you made a candid expression to me that I thought was really, really important. And that was your philosophy of how you approach these matters. And that is that ultimately these things are driven by green.
Yes, that's
And share
yeah.
that philosophy if you would.
Sure. So
And how that translates into making things happen.
sure. And so, I do a lot of projects for the city, and normally when I show up, I'm there to do a project because there's a market failure. Something isn't working from a market perspective to deliver the goods or services or whatever those things are to the citizens, the residents of the city of Madison. So in this case, there's a grocery store need, and the grocery store is leaving because they don't feel like they can make their profit margins work within their metrics. And to address that, whenever there's a market failure, that takes green. That's the bottom line. And that green can come in a lot of different forms. It can come in the form of land, it can come in the form of cash, it can come in the form of rent write-downs, all kinds of different ways to slice that. But as long as there is a market failure, the only way to plug that is with green. And there's a ton of different ways to do it, but unless and until you have that realization and to your point, the political will to put that in there, and whether it's from the municipality or a nonprofit or a mix of private enterprise and other things, you're still going to be fighting that uphill battle because private enterprise needs to make a reasonable return, whatever that is for that enterprise.
We hear a lot in this marketplace about the fact that there's not enough rooftops to support a grocery. And I think you probably heard some of those same sort of comments from the Southside neighborhood groups that you both have dealt with. And managing community expectations with the reality becomes a real challenge. Christy, if you could, because you've been there, you're in that marketplace, you operated a store in that marketplace, or just down the road, and you've listened to a lot of community groups. What was the first lesson that you had to share with the community in order to make people's expectations fall into the realm of being reasonable?
I think part of it is size. So, I think we're used to, people in general are used to a very large grocery store and a very large parking lot, and you walk in, and there are certain expectations, especially in the Midwest. But I think, this store is smaller. It's 24,000 square feet that I'm building, and that helps because when we're talking about a food desert and we're talking about green and all of the things that come part of it, it's also about, sales per square foot. It's about products, and it's about having, in my opinion, it's about having an independent retailer who can take a smaller footprint, which is what I'm trying to do in Madison, and still have the same experience, so that it doesn't feel like you're shopping a tiny store. And there's a lot of things that I can do and will be doing to make that experience the right experience for the people of Madison, and listening to the community members of what they're looking for. And as a grocer and as a retailer, looking at the horizon of what I think people are going to want, and making it a destination location, but also not allowing the space to limit my creativity. And I'm hoping that the people that this store is going to serve have an open mind, that they're going to shop the store and really have an open mind to hopefully the creativity that I bring to the store.
Pass the microphone down to Gail if you could. Gail, I know in your years with City Hall, you did go through some of the gyrations of trying to identify potential grocery operators who would look at the Southside market. What were the obstacles that you encountered in that process?
That was an interesting journey, and we had a host of grocers that we identified that we wanted to reach out to. And we knew the job center was going to be up for sale, that the county was moving. We saw that as an opportunity to pursue. The job center is like a 80,000 square foot building. To Christie's point, scale means everything. That helps to manage risk for the enterprise. And then what do you do with the rest of the space? Who's the landlord? I can tell you the city of Janesville should not be a landlord, just speaking from my experience, because, there's other priorities. And I was actually responsible for managing a small former bank just outside of my window on Milwaukee Street. I was the landlord. When I had to get a phone call, I had to deal with it. That was not my core service. When I think about government, you need to focus on your core services, and being a landlord is not it. A lot of the conversation was the number of households. What is the income in the households? One of the things at the time, this was a distressed census tract. Now, shockingly, this is no longer a distressed census tract. The positive of that means higher incomes. The negative of that is it takes away some possible funding streams for a project. So there's all these balances. And so a lot of the questions were, why did the former grocer fail? Why did the former grocer not make it work? I mentioned earlier I was a Cincinnati guy. When Kroger bought Pick and Save, I'm like, woo, yeah, they're going to do it right. And they'd already written it off. So there was a lot of those questions that, I was not in the position to really answer them other than speculate. So there's like all these factors. And then the last one was, what's the long-term plan for the corridor? There is no plan for this corridor right now. And that is always something that I struggled with as a city planner, is that if the city wants to direct investment into an area, there needs to be a plan for that basis. What does that look like? The DOT is going to come through and repave Center Avenue, I think it's in 2 years. There's no plan beyond that repaving to help spur additional investment in the private properties that create the tax revenue that help pay for all the other services the city provides. That's a concern. And that's a concern of the potential grocers saying, what's the commitment to this? So you have all of these things, and as a community leader inside City Hall, if you can't provide that assurance that you're all in committed, it's really tough to sell. And that's a big difference in what Dan was able to do versus what I was able to do in my tenure on this issue.
It's an incredible challenge, and there's a lot of pieces that have to come together in order to make a plan work. And it's interesting, the timing right now is particularly important for us to think about, in as much as the city of Janesville is going through a renewal of their master plan. And one of the deficiencies that, by golly, Gail, you and I have chatted about this a zillion and one times. We talked about it back in 2007 and 2008 when the last revision to the plan was put together. We don't have a plan for the business corridor that represents Center. We don't have a plan that represents the business core that's Court Street. We do not have a plan on the books that represents economic development on Milton Avenue. And for goodness sakes, we don't even have a plan on the books that represents the corridor that I like to call Ruger in Milwaukee on the east side. We do have a plan for downtown, and in order to get that plan for downtown, there was some gyrations that the private sector had to go through in order to get those in a position of exercising their political will to go along with it. And in fact, we provided the funding, the private sector provided the funding to do the master plan for the downtown area. But that's a huge obstacle. And if you don't have a plan, it's particularly challenging to try and put a piece on a chessboard when you haven't even been able to define the chessboard. Fair observation?
I would absolutely agree.
Dan, if you would, talk a little bit about what was in place in the city of Madison that made your job a little bit easier in terms of getting first that political will on a larger council that can be a little bit unwieldy, and in a community that has a reputation of being particularly challenging in terms of doing development. I mean, there's medals in there, if not sainthood, for somebody that can get through some of those things.
Absolutely.
Oh, I'm going to be real careful. This is where I get fired. So, Madison has its quirks. People have referred to it as sort of a full contact democracy, and I think that is very accurate. Yes, it's the other side of that, though, is that whatever comes out of that is most of the time something that the community very much supports, and if something isn't supported, it usually doesn't happen. And so you wind up with neighborhoods and parts of the city that are very, very, very invested into their place. The things that really drove a lot of this was we have policymakers that are committed to the things that they're committed to, and one of those is making sure that we don't have a newly formed food desert when Pick and Save ultimately closes. And that was a commitment that was made by the alder at the time and the mayor and other council members in adjoining districts, and they worked very hard to ensure that not only was their voice heard, but that their colleagues came along. I think also just the idea of ensuring that we don't have a food desert is something that resonates with policymakers in the city. There are parts of our city that are, like many communities, that are very affluent and have multiple options of high-end or even mid-range grocery stores within very easy reach. And then, oddly enough, it's the Southside, like in Janesville, which I don't know what that is. It's a strange sort of coincidence. Then the South, our South Madison was starting to have this challenge that we would lose the grocery store. And because it's our most diverse part of our community, there was a lot of concern that the more economically well-off parts of our community and the, quite frankly, whiter parts of our community had very easy access to all of these things. And yet, when it came time to sort of put our money where our mouth is, what are we going to do? We had a lot of conversations about equity and the historical, frankly, overlooking of South Madison. I'll note the alder who recently left the district just south of this said that a lot of people used to refer to South Madison as Hell's Half Acre. And I don't know if that was appropriate, but there was a lot of that view in the city for decades and decades of disinvestment and just sort of down there is whatever. And I think that has really turned around in the last 10 or 20 years, but that takes a lot of time to build up the desire to address these issues and then to get out and do them. And it is a big commitment from policymakers. And I will also note that I work with a lot of smart people who are very committed, very hardworking in both city government and in the private sector. With Christy and her team and the folks at Moving Out and Renewal, they have all worked extremely hard to make this happen. It is not easy. I like to say, if I'm showing up, it's a real challenge, because if the private sector could do it, they would. Somebody would do it and make a profit, and that would be much simpler. I don't make a profit at the end of the day. The city doesn't make a profit, but we have a policy goal. We've achieved something that the taxpayers and the residents and the policy makers of the city are looking for. In this case, not having a food desert in South Madison. And I can see, in Janesville, you've got some similar challenges, and it just takes a lot of commitment.
You went through an extensive request for proposal process. And as part of that process, you did get some responses from grocery operators who had an interest in coming to the area. and bottom line, they didn't work out because they couldn't meet the bottom line expectation. Somehow in that mix, Christy Meyer, you and your dad have a history. You operated a store here in Janesville on Milwaukee. And for a variety of reasons, that store didn't make it, and I want you to speak to that specifically. But I also want you, after you've spoken to the East Milwaukee store, talk a little bit about why this south side of Madison was so attractive to you, and why you can make it work.
Well, maybe I'll go backwards. So a couple of things I want to address is some of the stuff that has been previously talked about is the numbers also worked. So is the will of city council and the city, but the numbers also helped. Now there is a currently active pick and save, and so in a very unique situation, this pick and save will close at the same time as the Mowers Urban Market will open, which is very atypical. And I think we're all very happy that Pick and Save is willing to be a good partner. So there's already a set amount of sales there. We're going to assume some sales. And so that's where, and I guess I'm going to backtrack for 1 second, because running and owning a grocery store is unlike having a shirt, store.
Haberdashery.
Yes, thank you. Haberdashery, that's a fantastic word. Not well used often. But so in that situation, groceries, and I'm going to use strawberries. So if I, as the grocer, if I buy strawberries but no one buys them or doesn't purchase them from me, I still have to expound on that. I still have to pay that. And so that's where, and you will probably, I'm sure you've heard at City Council as well, that grocery margins are low, and it's hard for independents and hard for retailers to have a grocery store. And so I think one of the things that we need is volume, and the Madison location is working out because not only do people want it, and it's a food desert and it's necessary, but the numbers also support it, which Gail can probably attest to, helps the bank. And so when I'm going to the bank, which I'm going through that process now, and I can actually, I live it right in this moment, I have to say there's a lot of growth coming as well. Not only do the numbers support it, and here are all the numbers that I've done over the course of time to prove that, but then here's this development, and here's this other development, and this other project is coming in 2 years. All of those things help me sell it to the bank, who's looking at me with a fine tooth, eye, very critical and judgmental, which they should be. But so those are the things that help, that development along the corridor, and I think that's where Madison has done a great job of having that. And you also asked me, so for
The east side here.
yes, here. So my dad and I we had a couple of stores. We started in Madison, not far from this current location. And then throughout the course of time, we worked on a project in Columbus, here in Janesville, spent, I think, 2 years. So if you shopped in that store, you saw me. And then, yes, exactly, that's where I met Rich a long time ago. And then we also opened a store in Milwaukee. And the store that we had here, obviously didn't make it. It is now sadly a quick trip, or I guess not sadly, but it was sad that we had to leave. And unfortunately in that situation, it was about sales. And we just weren't getting the sales that we needed to support the store, especially the store of that size. So we were spending more in, things being thrown away than we could afford to. And we had to make a very sad decision, which was very sad because my dad told me at Cookie Day. So I had to be nice at a holiday party as I was being found that news. But it was unfortunate and not something that we wanted to see or something that we anticipated happening. But unfortunately, the sales just didn't support it. And so we had to make that decision or risk losing our other store in Wisconsin Dells, which had been funding it for quite some time. So it was unfortunate, and I'm sad for that, ultimately. But one of the reasons you had asked me about this other project in Madison, and it's really because the numbers and the project, it kind of is a combination of so many things that are all working together. And ultimately, it's that the size of the store and the projected sales make those numbers make sense. for all the justifications that I have to give. Sorry, that was long.
And there's an element to the plan that needs, I guess, to be talked about a little bit, and that's some of the creative financing elements that are part of this overall project that make the economics actually work. And between the two of you, if you could take a minute or two and explain that element of the project so that we have a better understanding. Because so far, we've kind of established that in order to do anything, we need to have a plan. And that plan has to reflect the wishes of the community. And the partners that make it happen, in the case of Madison, it's the city of Madison, it's the private sector, in this case it's Mowers Market, it's the neighborhoods who have come to an agreement that this is something that they want to pursue, and they want to be loyal to, and they want to purchase at this site in this location. So it's a unique partnership that involves a lot of people. But in order to make the numbers work and to make that philosophy that you espoused earlier come to reality, that there is green at the end of all of this, so somehow you have to put some creative things on paper that make it happen. So who would like to take that one on?
Dan can. You can start.
Yeah. So the city of Madison, as I noted when I first kind of started talking about this, we've owned the piece of property that we're developing now for well over a decade. So that helps in the sense that it's not all the money going out the door all at once. That's a huge help, because I'm just gonna be really upfront. The numbers that I'm gonna throw out there, I'm glad you're all sitting down, because I don't want anyone to fall over and pass out because of the dollars and cents we're talking about. But it's real, because what we're doing is we're fixing a market failure. So we bought the land for around $1 million, just over $1.1 million. We then had it for about a decade, and we started going through this redevelopment process. And as we went through the development process and came up with development partners in rural enterprises and moving out, they asked for us to write that land down and give it to them for $1. So now, for those of you tracking this at home, we're in for just over $1 million. They also, because they're building affordable housing, needed another $300,000 on top of that to make their affordable housing portion work. So again, if you're keeping track, that's about $1.3 million, $1.4 million. As we got through that, they then had their quirks with having to sell or have somebody buying the grocery store, that grocery condo, for about $4.6 million. So again, if you're keeping track, now we're in for about $6 million. So we're talking real money, right? This is not small, but each of these things happens over time. Additionally, we knew that the grocer, in this case, by the point we had gotten there, would need some additional assistance to build out the grocery store. So all the money up to this point is, for those municipal folks in the room, either just straight municipal debt, just general obligation bonds borrowed by the city and paid back on the levy. Additionally, now we've got another, let's say, $3.5 million into the grocery store itself. That's the build out, the coolers and things like that Christy can talk a little more about. So at this point, we're in for about $9.5 million. And then one more fun part, we're putting in a new street, and because of assessment policy, which every community has, we hit ourselves with another $500,000 of street improvements. So the hits just keep coming, but it got done. And because of the plan that was in place, the political will that was there to do it, we are, knock on wood, nearly to the point of building this store out, opening it up, and having what policymakers have directed us to do done. Now again, each of those pieces took over time. It's not all $10 million on the barrelhead right up front, but it's long-term commitment. It's long-term investment, and making sure that the goals that you set forth are out there and that you stick to them.
And being okay with the long-term payback.
Yes, and being okay with the long-term payback. The one thing I will note is the last piece of that $3.5 million, that will be repaid to the city through lease payments from Mowers Markets, because the city will own that condominium, and the lease payments that come in will ultimately pay off that debt that the city has incurred. So there's a chunk of it that's just sitting on the tax roll that we pay for, but part of it is covered by the lease payments of the grocery store.
Christie, if you could speak to that too, how the grocery store finance structure fits into this picture.
So that's really a critical part. You know, when Dan and I started our conversations, I think I was pretty upfront or transparent with where, you know, my max lending was going to get me to, and that there was still going to be a deficit. So I very quickly up front, you know, said ballpark figure for a grocery store to open by putting all the cases in and the coolers and all the nice things that you see in a grocery store. It takes anywhere from, you know, I'm just going to use a round number, $300 a square foot. So if this grocery store is 24,000 square feet, let's say we use $300 as a square foot, you know, we're over, what, I think I told you $7.5 million for build out. That's without operating, that's without hiring anyone, a uniform, nothing, that's just putting the equipment in. And so that was part of our honest conversation, and that's where the solutions started coming. As a grocer, I knew I was not going to be able to buy well, in some cases, the land or the condo, and also build out an entire store that was just well past what I was capable of doing, as well as what, you know, is limiting for a lot of independent retailers is that. And that's where the city really came up with some great solutions, and that's helping us get the deal done.
Share with us the rent structure.
So in any, well, at least I can speak for a grocer, you know, the first, and I told Dan this when we met many years ago, the first 3 years are critical. So when we looked at the rent structure, we're really focusing on those first 3 years and making sure that the store is solid and secure. And I think one of the many neighborhood association meetings we went to, they wanted to make sure that they had a grocer for a long time. Not for a short period of time, not for 2 years and fizzle out, but for a long time. So our conversations have always been, what is going to make this grocery store last until I'm ready to retire? And that at least. And that has been always our focus. And so for myself, when I look at grocery store and grocery store operations, those first couple of years are the most critical, where everything is tight, everything is coming down to the wire. How much can I afford to lose during that first year? And there's a lot of unknowns. And I think that's also where an independent can be successful. And we said this with the neighborhood associations when we met with them. When you have an independent grocer who's working in the business, and I will be there every day, I'm going to know what's not working or what is working, and listen to the neighborhood and adjust. You know, I'm not going to have to send it to corporate, or I'm not going to have to ask somebody. I'm just going to go ahead and do it. And I think that's where, you know, this combination of financing helps the whole project.
Dan next, and then Gail.
I want to add one more thing to this. Something that both Gail and you and Heather have mentioned earlier is the other piece of this, and we haven't talked really about this. We could have a whole other conversation about this. Is the city is investing substantial dollars into South Madison. We have several plans in place. One that was just adopted a couple of years, about 18 months ago, 24 months ago, that's investing over $100 million of city dollars into South Madison. And we have, and Christy mentioned as well, we have additional dollars coming in and additional projects coming in within almost a stone's throw of where the new grocery store will be. At the same time, we are still taking the plan that we've adopted a year or two ago and implementing that plan. We're taking those dollars, we're doing things like land banking, buying properties proactively and setting them up and positioning them for redevelopment. We are working with other programs for first-time home buyers or small business assistance and things like that. So the South Madison that's there today is probably different by the time I get home than when I left this morning, and will continue to be so, and hopefully in a way that benefits the folks that live there. But it starts with that political commitment, and I think several folks have said it, the plan that's in place to make these things happen.
Gail.
So one of the things I wanted to touch on was Dan's comment about general obligation bonds. And this is important, and I'm speaking from a banker and from an economic development professional. So when Christie is looking at a pro forma and having to pay rents at some period of time, that rent, because Dan and the city council provided general obligation bonds to finance those improvements on the interior, allows them to have a lower rent. So for the long-term standpoint, Mauer's Urban Market benefits because their cost of doing business operating that store is now less. And that's one of the challenges I used to hear when I was in the ED chair, was that why would the city take this risk on? And I would explain it in that financial sense. And as a banker, we would look at it the same way. And in fact, if Christie goes to the bank and says, I need $7 million to do this build out, that interest rate's going to be a lot higher than what the city of Madison paid on that general obligation bond. And that is some of the kind of the secret sauce that never gets discussed, because it's that creative capital stack approach that makes it happen. The magic, right? Yeah. We used to joke in the third floor of City Hall, we're making magic today. And it was that creativity that makes it possible. And that's one of the things that I think sometimes as community members we lose, or we don't understand, or we don't get that education about, because there are people like Dan that said, we're going to make magic. We got to do this. How do you do it? And that's what gets them to work every day. I can guarantee you that, because that's what it used to do for me too. But from a banking perspective, that's again, you see the commitment of the community into the project, which reduces risk for the bank. Ultimately, you have a deposit at a bank. The bank is doing everything it can to minimize risk to do the loan. Period. Done. And if there's a partnership, it makes it easier.
Pass it down to Heather if you would. Heather, you've had the opportunity to hear a lot of information in a very short period of time. Initial thoughts and observations.
I think one of our biggest hurdles moving into discussions regarding something along these lines would be to get the city council on board. Because quite honestly, and there's no secret that I've been a cheerleader for the Southside because I live here. Nobody else does. Nobody lives on the west side. Well, we do have a city council member who lives on the far west side, but I am the Southside. I cheerlead for it because we are much more on the south side than an industrial park, and I don't like being bid as the industrial side of Janesville. And so looking forward, we need to make our northeast community understand that there's a whole secret sauce that needs to happen on the south side, because this is important too. We are not the industrial park. And so moving forward, that was one of my goals with our new city manager coming on board from Waukesha. He has 15 years. We are going to tap into all sorts of creative things that he has given us a little hint about. And so I'm hopeful that number one, we can create a plan for the South Side corridor, because there's been mention of the Milton Avenue corridor and revamping some things downtown, but at the end of the day, we are not going to lay low and let this happen and be another forgotten part of the city. You know, I'm glad that we have all of this growth in the industrial park. I'm glad to see these neighborhoods blooming, because we're seeing a lot of new construction. I don't want to be labeled as the industrial side of Janesville, because we're not.
Okay. Set down this way. And that gets us to the point where we want to take on some of the questions that are coming in from the audience, because these are important questions. And the first question, really, it's a general question, but it has so many different implications. It kind of relates to the whole concept of we need a plan, and we don't have a plan. And we don't have a plan for economic development management in any of our business corridors. And, you know, we got a big project on the north side that's going to spur a lot of economic development activity in theory, but there's no plan as to where it's going to go, what it's going to be, and how it's going to be managed at all. And we certainly don't have that on the south side. How do you get a store interested in this area? And from the audience, who do you start talking to start making some of this happen? Where do we begin? What's the starting point, Dan?
This could go a lot of directions,
Mhm.
and there's a dozen places where you could start with this. One thing that we are doing for the first time in Madison is, as I mentioned earlier, we have parts of the city that have done very, very, very well, both in terms of new development, tax base, and economic generation. One of the things that we are doing this time in South Madison is, and Gail, you'll appreciate this, is we have tax increment finance districts, and I could talk for several hours about that. It's lots of fun. But it's a way that, it's a lot of fun. Municipal bureaucracy jokes just go haywire. But what it does allow is it allows the municipality to invest dollars into that tax increment finance area. What we've done is we are taking dollars from very successful TIF districts and transferring them into other areas and using that as cash up front to help spur reinvestment in some of these places that might be a little more risky historically. And I think just hearing some of the comments that you've made, that might be a way to fund some things like that. Now, what you do with that, obviously, as you mentioned, you need a plan, you need to have some political commitment, but that's a starting point as far as a toolbox that you could start to open to use to do things that you come up with in the plan. After that, that's a local prerogative, that's a policymaker thing.
Okay, and Gail is chomping at the bit
Come
to
on.
talk a little bit about how you direct increment that's generated in a tax district in the most effective fashion. And there's a lot of room for where this can go to.
There is. I'm going to touch on a couple of things. Janesville has a long history of tax increment financing. It's been historically focused on industrial. During my tenure, we got into more of the commercial and the downtown focus. In the late '00s, the city actually adopted a tax increment finance district for Center Avenue. And then we hit the Great Recession. The values went down too far. We were never going to recover. We folded the TIF district, and it's never come back to fruition. So there's two ways that you can use successful tax increment finance district funds to help other areas. One is a half-mile boundary, where you have a half mile. The idea is that the investment in the geographic area will have positive influence on areas beyond its boundaries. So you can take increment in the middle of the district and spend it within a half mile on items that are in the project plan that achieve the goals of the project plan. That's where it gets debatable. What are those priorities? I'm going to get back to that in a minute. Two is a special project. So the Joint Review Board can approve a special project within that half mile. The other way is if you have a mixed-use district that is creating extra increment or sufficient interest increment, you can take that positive increment and move it to another TIF district of the same kind within the same taxing jurisdictions or if another district is failing. I think I've got that fully right here.
Yeah.
Pretty
No,
much.
It's enough for now.
Yeah. The challenge is, again, the prioritization. So ironically, on the next city council agenda, there is a proposal for the GM property to have a TIF district. And then there's a trailing amendment to allow half-mile boundary expenditures and to move increment from GM to be spent downtown. Gale Price has some challenges with that, or difficulties with that, and I'm just speaking for Gale Price. Because we have Center Avenue that's right next to Jatco, right? What a great place to spend money, because it's within that half mile at Jatco. You get jobs created there, you get increment created there. Let's spend it right next door, rather than sending it downtown. So I would encourage you to go out to the city website, read a little bit about this TIF project plan, talk to Heather and other council members. Sorry, your phone's gonna ring. But it's important because there's a policy decision there, and that policy has to be based on good sound principles. And my personal feeling is this particular proposal isn't the best principles.
We could have an entire show on tax increment financing districts, and we could probably spend a good portion of that show just talking about tax increment finance district, proposed district number 42. And we'll hear more about that. I want to get back to questions from the audience, and I will apologize in advance to folks from the audience that I'm going to try and get as many of these in as I possibly can. And if there are questions that have been covered by somebody else's question, you may not hear your specific question get asked. But I will try and get in as many as I can. And I'm going to probably miss and not do those things that are basically editorial statements as opposed to a question. So I want to try and do this as quickly and as efficiently as possible. I think you've already answered this one, Christy. At one point, you had a store in East Milwaukee. Why did it close? We talked about that. What's the motivation to come back to Janesville, especially the Southside? Why now? What is your store's price point, premium or lower? You're not really proposing to come back to Janesville, so
No.
and we haven't gotten to that stage, and so that's one that I'm going to push along. Here's one that you can address, though. How do you make grocery prices be affordable compared to the other stores? How do you make that work in an urban environment where your competition are big box stores, and you're dealing with it day in and day out in Madison? How do you make it work in the environment you're going to be on in the South Side?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question, and it's something that an independent retailer like myself struggles with every day. Our goal is to have from our wholesaler and all of our vendor partners to get the lowest cost of goods that we absolutely can. As an independent, we're already at a disadvantage because we're not a huge chain, but that's where I think we can strive because it's an everyday battle, and we do treat it as a battle. To get the lowest cost of goods and then to pass that cost of goods. What you'll see and something that we're trying in our Dells market is because of inflation and because of everything that's happening, we actually have our ad is even, I'll use retailer language, hotter than it is that it has been in the past. And with that, we're basically passing just a sheer cost on. So as a savvy shopper, which so many of you are, you're going to see that ad, and that's where you can really capitalize on it. And I think there are things that independents can do. We do a lot of events. We do a buy something, get a whole bunch of things free. We have our Rib Fest, which I still have some Janesville people who come up to the Dells to get their ribs from us, which brings a lot of joy to my heart, actually. But so there are a lot of things that independents can do. I will admit, it's a struggle, but it is something that can be done. And looking at what we call a blend, which is, if the cans of goods are lower, where can we split that difference? What can we do? What kind of negotiations can we do with our vendor partners? And that's really important too.
This one, I think, is going to be a Gail Price question, and not that you're necessarily absolutely on top of all of the codes and covenants and restrictions that we face, but the question is this: if the idea of a grocery store with apartments above it is on the south side is approved, how many apartments potentially could you be talking about? And what is affordable housing, and why does it have a terrible connotation?
Well, we could have a whole nother conversation.
Good luck. This is
Goodness,
show
it's
number
Gail.
3.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so how many apartments in a mixed-use building? Well, it really depends on a number of factors. What is the apartments focused on from a residency standpoint? Because that does affect parking. So like a senior project would have fewer parking space requirements than a full market rate project or family project. And then it also depends on size of the lot, the particular zoning district, because in Janesville, our commercial zones have no height limitation, so you could go way up high. Now, on the south side, there is a limitation due to the airport. That's a whole nother conversation. So it's this kind of gelling of factors that really dictate what is, what the number of units would be. A lot of times you'll see a developer kind of focus in on a certain number, and it's really going back to the building code and that cost per square foot of construction. So if you saw the River Flats building downtown, that was maximized for the size of the site and the vertical envelope that the building code would allow, wood frame construction that was 1 hour treated all the way around the exterior. The building inspector means coming out, I apologize. So there's a ton of factors. Every project's different. Affordable housing. What is defined as affordable housing? And really it comes back to area median income of your community, your census tract, and what your need is of housing. So, it's basically the idea in a lot of these tax credit projects is that the private sector is running these. I mean, the days of the Cabrini Greens are gone. The private sector knows how to run affordable housing, run apartment buildings. How does the public sector partner in that? And that is using tax credits to underwrite the equity into the project, and then there's a number or percentage of units that have to be provided. The percentage is based on the percentage of area median income for the families that are in the units. And this is a very competitive process. It's crazy because there's, 150 applications every year in the state of Wisconsin. And a project in Janesville has to compete against a project in Madison, a project in Milwaukee that may have more needs than Janesville. So there's all these crazy factors. But why does it have a negative connotation? Well, unfortunately, people perceive that others that are of lower socioeconomic status are not as good as them. It's unfortunate. It's our society. We need to get past that. One of the tools that the city staff used on the River Flats project was we presented a list of city positions that would qualify for the affordable housing project downtown. That was an eye-opener because people are like, wait a minute, these new employees at the city of Janesville would qualify, or school teachers, police officers. It's real.
30% of my workforce in the health system that I retired from would qualify.
Now the hope is that they're just getting started, they're working their way up, and then they're moving on, and that's the concept, the idea. But unfortunately, it's perception, not reality.
Testify.
I'm going to try and bunch some of these together too, because we've got about 20 minutes, and I want to get in as many of these as we possibly can for live streaming. And I would remind folks that when we stop the actual live streaming at 7:30, our guests will be here and they will be more than happy to entertain individual questions from you for as long as it takes to get that through. They've promised me that they're here for the duration, so I would offer that. And I'm going to read some of these as close to verbatim as I can. As a resident of the Southside, we've been against the growth and redevelopment of the industrial park in the backyards of our subdivisions. We've expressed our concerns, but they've fallen on deaf ears. How is this talk of a grocery store going to be heard if our concerns weren't taken into consideration when the subject of the industrial park first came up? That goes hand in hand with the South Side is somewhat stark and unappealing aesthetically because of the businesses leaving and closing and long-standing vacancies. Without a plan in place to improve the South Side economically, will that potentially hurt a new grocery store in the South Side? Heather Miller, that sounds just like it's something designed for you.
Well, a lot of that unfortunately, that does come across my desk. It comes in the emails and I hear it. I've heard it since day one, literally since day one. And I think to actually make something happen, we need to get our other city council members on board that live on the north and the east side, because you're flooded with commerce. You're flooded. I mean, literally, our grocery is flooded, our retail is flooded. Anything you want, you go to the northeast side and you have it. And so we are the forgotten entity of Janesville. And so when I hear we need a plan for the redevelopment of Milton Avenue because we're talking about the Woodman's Community Center, I think to myself, hold on. We have needed redevelopment on the south side for 5, 8, 10 years. Let's look at that. And so changing the mindset of our council members, that has to be a priority. Because if that doesn't happen, we're going to continue to hit a brick wall. Not in my backyard. I don't see it. I don't visit it. It's not my problem. And it needs to be everybody's problem because this is a city. It's a community. And this is where the need has to be focused.
Okay. I'm going to try, and I was almost going to say, I'd leave this with Gail because this may be in your lap next. You were in the hot seat at this point in time when Festival Foods was first approved and came to the city, and you were still around when Hy-Vee began having its first conversations with the city. All of those came, and they were able to go ahead and be built, and the city went through its approval processes, and how did these plans come together if there wasn't a hard and fast plan in place to approve them, and where did the political will come from? And then the second half of that question is, so what do we do to develop a plan for the South Side?
Festival and Hy-Vee were literally those laissez-faire development kind of things. I mean, I had just taken the position as the economic development director. The Kmart closed. I got a call probably 3 or 4 weeks later from an executive at Festival. We want to build. Can we sit down and talk? We sit down and talk. We want city to help. We had no position. We were not. We had not changed our policy to promote redevelopment of commercial land in the highway business area or what we would call the regional shopping area. So from my perspective, there was nothing the economic development could do. They actually responded, well, okay, if you can't do that, can you get us done in 3 months through the approval process? Well, I'm inquisitive. Why? Well, we could actually apply for new market tax credits, which is another tax credit program that ends up structuring equity into the project. It fit the perfect wheelhouse for it. And I walked into the planning director's office and said, these guys want to come. We need this thing bulldozed. I can't finance it, but you can get it done if you get it done in 3 months. And our planning staff did. And part of the challenge there was, how long do you let it sit? At the time we were still looking at the ugly former Menards that was just falling apart, and it was an eyesore, an entryway into the community. So again, the market factors drove that to happen. So fast forward to the Hy-Vee store. The economic development staff had reached out to Hy-Vee on a number of occasions about the Southside. We continue those conversations over the years, and the city had a proposal for storage units to go into the former Shopco. There was a recommendation for a denial because it would be a negative on our regional shopping area. Long story short, the Plan Commission said no, which is rare. They said no, go away. And in our regular cycle of conversations with grocers and Hy-Vee, my staff member calls Hy-Vee, says, we're still talking about the South Side. We're applying for a grant to hopefully redevelop it. And they said no, but tell us about Shopko. And then the ball just started rolling. So again, it's the market-driven decision on that. And one of the challenges is many of these larger grocers, they play what's referred to as the pack mentality. I gotta be with everyone else because you have this draw of the scale. And for the South Side, that's not gonna happen. You don't have enough other retailers to draw people to this corridor. So how do we get to a plan? Talk to your council members, email your council members. They see every June a strategic plan. Now, I had a few other kind of smart comments for it. But the fact is that the idea of a strategic plan is that you prioritize things over the next 5 years as to where you're making your time and energy investment. And hopefully setting aside resources to make it happen. The council has the authority to ensure that that is a priority in the strategic plan. One, to create a plan for the corridor, which then tells the city manager that he needs to tell the planning division, make this happen. They go through the process to make it happen. And then two, the resources are set aside to help make that happen. And then they could add, let's get a grocery store on the South Side. To Dan's comment, all political will is right there making it happen.
This one comes back to you, Dan. We're going to let you sit there quietly for very long. How will the increased land valuation from the development that is going to be occurring on the south side of Madison ultimately end up help pay down the debt the city of Madison is incurring to go forward with this project?
Okay, so the debt that the city has incurred, if you recall, there were sort of the two pieces that I talked about. The one is everything before investment into the grocery build-out itself. So the grocery build-out is being repaid through the lease. That's roughly $3.5 million. The other, let's call it 6.5, just for round numbers, that is on just the city's general tax levy. That's repaid with anything else that we do if we buy or if we decide to build a fire station or invest in a park or whatever cities normally do. As far as redevelopment in South Madison, as it comes to this particular project or projects around it, increasing density leads to a higher property value, which leads to higher tax revenue for the city. And that's really been one of the biggest things that has driven valuation and tax receipts within the city. I think we just passed 30 $37 billion in total assessed value for the city. And it's, Madison has the problem of everybody wants to move there, which is great, except we can't build houses fast enough. I've read somewhere that if we built 4,000 units overnight, just in the city, we would have to build 2,000 units a year, every year, in perpetuity going forward to keep up with the growth. And that's just in the city of Madison. That's not any of the surrounding communities, Middleton, DeForest, Sun Prairie, Verona, etc. So we have the relative luxury of demand for the land. We have demand for those units, and that is what it's basic economics, supply and demand. There's only so much of it, and when folks want to move there to be there, it drives the rents up, it drives land prices up, and that is what pays for an awful lot of these things. I'm sure our finance director could tell you all the other things that it is a challenge, but that's another story.
Christy, this one's for you. And I think we've touched on it a little bit, but maybe you can elaborate just a little bit further.
Sure.
You've opened your doors and you're operating the market. How's your new grocery store going to keep the prices down and keep things affordable and compete with the larger chains that you have to compete with? Because frankly, you're in a bigger market, but you're still competing with the big chains. You've got Woodman's, and you've got Hy-Vee, and you've got Walmart, and by golly, you even have Target all in the grocery business. How are you going to do it? How are you going to make it successful?
Well, I'll first start with I'm very feisty. So that's the first thing I would start with. No. Really, ultimately, and Madison is like Janesville in that it's one of the most competitive grocery markets in the country. I think Madison actually has the distinction of being the toughest grocery market in the country, which is a really fun adage as a grocer. So I think one of the things that I'm doing and continue to do is levying my my size, even though I am an independent, making sure that I'm partnering with the right wholesaler. That is key. And it's really about, and Dan and I have had these conversations, and a lot of conversations with the neighborhood associations, it's about partnership. We're kind of all in this together. So the neighborhood needs the grocer needs the neighborhood, the city needs the grocer, the city needs the neighborhoods, and it's this continuation of a conversation of a partnership. And especially when we've been having discussions and as we've went round and round on conference calls, and when we get to sticking points, we have to remember that we're in it together. And I think from a pricing standpoint, that really helps. If my operating costs in terms of rent, especially in the beginning, if my expenses are lower, if I'm getting help on rent or a lower rent percentage, and that allows me to keep the costs of goods down as well. And so it all is part of the conversation of I need to go to the market, I need to go to my wholesaler and make sure that I'm absolutely getting the lowest cost of goods that I can. Looking at who other partners I can partner with, but also keeping all my operating expenses down and doing absolutely everything I can to be as efficient and as lean as possible, which goes back to size. And can I go back because Gail brought something up about Hy-Vee and Hy-Vee and Festival are great operators, and it comes down to, Hy-Vee didn't come to the Southside, and I think part of that is probably size. There are a lot of retailers who know how to do one size or two sizes. They have a certain footprint so that their map works. And if they can't get that size, whether that's 50,000 square feet or 200,000 square feet, they aren't going to do the project because they have a map and they have to maintain that. And what you're asking here on the south side is for someone to deviate from their map or from their plan as a grocer. And so that's where you have to find a grocer who goes, okay, we don't need our standard operating procedure. We're going to think outside the box. We're going to do something different. And that's where I think you have to sometimes look at who else out there could do something that isn't going to have to follow their formula.
Thank you. And I think there you have it. This next question from the audience really takes us to the bottom line. And it's very simple. It says, so the bottom line is, are we getting a store? And the answer to that is, do you have a plan? if you have a plan, who are your partners? If you've got a plan and partners, who are you going to approach in order to make things happen? And finally, if you approach the right people, are you willing to invest the time, the energy, and the talent to make it all happen? And it's not an easy case to make. It wasn't an easy case to make a grocery work on the south side of Madison, but they had a plan, and they had the political will, and they had a council that said, do it, make it happen. And they had an operator that said, I can work within the parameters of what I have in order to be successful. And they had a neighborhood that said, we'll support you. And that's the magic that makes it all come together. Gail raised a very important point. There's an opportunity that's going to come up sooner than later, and that's getting involved in how monies are directed that are generated out of a proposed tax increment financing district, District number 42. It's an ideal opportunity, if you're interested, to let your voice be known. Heather is here tonight. Councilmember Williams is here tonight. I think I saw Councilmember Nino in the back there as well. Those are three individuals that I would hope in the next few minutes or so that you'd spend some time having a conversation. Share with them what you're thinking and feeling and what your hopes and dreams are. I hope tonight has been helpful to you in, if nothing more, generating some ideas and perhaps creating a little bit more desire to have something come to fruition and reality. So Christy, I thank you so very, very much. Christy Maurer, you are a charm.
Thank you.
You absolutely. It's good to see you again.
You too.
Dan, it's a pleasure. Dan is a wealth of information, and I was serious when I said something about medals, and I won't go sainthood, but there's something room in there for medals. Gail, always a pleasure. Thank you for being here. Heather, congratulations again. You folks are willing to stick around for the audience for a while, and I thank everybody for the opportunity. If you like the beginning of the conversation that we've started tonight, please plan on being a part of it going forward. We do this because we care about our community. We do this because we want to make sure that issues of importance to you are talked about, and that folks have a roadmap on how to get issues addressed with the powers that be that are out there. And I guess I'd close with the fact that we only get done what we get done because of your support. And we certainly appreciate that support. Thank you again for your attention. And down the road here a piece, we'll have a big announcement about our next plans for the next broadcast of the Rock County Civics Academy. Thank you so very much for your time. Good night.